Hello, my name is Brendan Decora, and I want to welcome you to my podcast, Pro Audio Profiles. Here, I'm going to interview recording engineers, mixers, producers, and others in the pro audio field. Together, we're going to learn how you can make amazing records that can give your listeners goosebumps. Welcome to the show. On today's show, we have Sonny DiPerri. He's a great engineer who's worked with artists such as Portugal the Man, Animal Collective, and The Devil Wears Prada. Hope you enjoy. So I just want to thank you for being here, first and foremost. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Of course. So I wanted to start with a little bit of your backstory. If you want to just go real quickly over just highlighted projects and whatever you want to talk about briefly.
Sure. I came from playing in bands. I came from a musical family. My father and grandfather were drummers. My dad still gigs in his band and plays around New England. I was in local bands and even in Boston in a few local bands that sort of fell apart and never really came together. And I don't know how it really happened, but I had the idea to move to California with a bunch of friends.
Don't know how it happened.
And I really don't. It's interesting. There was a few people where I was living that had studios in houses, and they were making punk and hardcore records. So I thought it would be so cool to be in a band again. And a few of my friends were audio engineers, so they could teach me how to do that. And we could rent a house and live on the West Coast, you know?
Cool.
Sounds cool. And no one showed up to the airport after they paid me back for their plane tickets. And And my really good friend Adam was already out here, and he said, "Don't worry about it. Let's just hang out. We'll find an apartment." And we landed in Burbank.
Cool.
And, right after I moved to California, 4 or 5 days in, I got an interview to apprentice for a producer in a band, and I had zero studio experience, and off I went, you know.
You didn't go to like any sort of recording school or anything, huh?
No, I went to a music school to study composition and film scoring and music education.
Okay.
And that was great. But I had played on some albums, like projects in the college, and then my band had done their own albums. Mm-hmm. But I had zero. It's embarrassing how little I knew. You know, I walked into this control room, and I remember the producer had said to me, "Okay, so we're using an API 512C and an 1176 to cut the vocal." And they had no other outboard gear yet because it was all being ordered.
Okay.
So I remember looking at the 512C, looking at the 1176 and going, "I know those are the two things that you just mentioned. Don't know what they do. Don't know what they are." You know? And I think it's the truth is, I said, "Look, all I want, you don't even have to pay me. I'll just watch y'all make a record because I want to see and learn how to make real sounding stuff." Mm-hmm. And they basically said, "Great, you can go pick up coffee and tune drums and take trash out for 6 months."
That's how it goes.
And I survived. Yeah. And I picked up every little detail just because I was so excited by it. You know, I feel like when you've never been in a recording studio before, mm-hmm. and you're getting this amazing hands-on experience where you see real artists with real engineers making real records, it sounds like the radio when you're listening. Right. It's that good. And that is something that I'll take with me everywhere I go.
I still remember that myself. Like the first time, you know, I did go to recording school, but the first time I was interning at a studio and I got into the room and was on a session, I still remember vividly, like mm-hmm. going in the control room and hearing a record come out, you know, and it was like this big aha moment where, you know, it's like, okay, there's people playing in the room out there, but then you go in this room and this is the album, you know? So it was very interesting for me to hear that for the first time.
It's a powerful experience. It doesn't leave you, especially I'm a drummer by trade. And mm-hmm. every time I had been recorded, in my head it was supposed to sound a certain way, and it was never close.
Right.
So I remember the first time tuning a drum kit, having a real engineer record that drummer playing drums.
Right.
I sat in the control room. I think I had to hang my head because it was just like, this is so amazing how this
Nice.
feels, you know.
Nice.
Yeah, I'll never forget it. Yeah, and I did the whole. I was basically a British T-boy and worked my way up to being an assistant and taking the recall notes with all the photos and the Barry Rudolph sheets and
Yep.
logging everything and all the patches, as you know how it goes. And
Yep.
yeah, just started. And then I think after I did my apprenticeship, my mentor had said to me, it's really important that you get some commercial studio experience. And I never got the opportunity to work at a big spot like you at East West. I was working at 2 indie studios in town, one called The Lair and one called King Size. And I was the staff person, so I was doing 6 projects a week, and they're all different. And sometimes I'm assisting, sometimes I'm mixing, or sometimes I'm recording. And when no one's using the studio, I was playing drums with 10 mics up so I could learn how they all sounded.
Right. And what are, since then, we've actually worked on, a couple projects. What are some of the other highlights you have?
Sure. So from there, you and I met when we were working with Animal Collective, which was a dream come true for me.
That was awesome.
I had worked with a bunch of their friends. Yeah. I had sort of been in their orbit. I'd worked on a few of their other side projects, and one of the singers, Dave, and I had become close when he was living in LA. And I remember we were having lunch one day, and he said, I think it'd be really cool if you recorded the band. I had to do like a. Okay, are you sure? You think I can handle this?
Right.
Okay, let's do it.
Awesome.
So yeah, I did four different releases with Animal Collective. I did an early full length for a band called Warpaint from LA. That was really special. Some other special ones were Portugal the Man. I've been working with that band since 2010, on and off in some capacity, which has been so cool to see their meteoric rise and success. And they've taken me along with them. Yeah, and it's just, they're great, so that's really fun. Another highlight for me that I think is, I definitely listen to often, it just came out recently, but Emma Ruth Rundle is an artist I work with often, and she's got just her very own brand of music and style. So I love working with her too.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. And we have one other thing in common where we actually both worked for Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross for a little while. I know my experience was amazing. Those guys are great. I have nothing bad to say, obviously. Super fun. Do you want to add any comments about your experience?
Yeah, it changed my life in the best way possible. Not only did I gain a lot of skills that I really needed, but I got to see 2 people who do things differently, originally, and very creatively work together. And it was so good for me because it really helped me get fast, because they work so quickly. So you gotta manage the console, you gotta do the patch, which MIDI interface is it, which computer is it, and then
now I had to learn a lot of new skills myself too with that. It's like I've been working in studios for a long time, and all those synths and MIDI interfacing and everything, it's crazy.
Yeah. And it was really funny. I think my biggest takeaway from that experience, but I think it's true of all great visionaries, is it doesn't matter what they're using. They just come up with something. I remember watching them write, and I had that moment where I went, this is incredible. And this sounds like them. It doesn't sound like anybody else. So it's not the wrench, it's the plumber, I guess.
Right.
You could say.
I like to say
it was amazing.
It's not the kitchen, it's the cooking. You know what I mean?
Yeah, man.
Absolutely.
And as you know too, like, those dudes are funny, which is also really cool.
It's cool. It was a fun time for sure. So one of the things that the podcast is kind of focused on is, how to help your artists in the studio to inspire them and to, work with them so that they can get the best results possible. Is there anything you in your workflow that you do to kind of encourage that?
Yeah, I try to handle a lot of the technical stuff before we start. So I have a few convos with whoever I'm working with, see kind of what we're going for. I try to build a few situations so people can bounce around a little bit. And I think what really helps people sort of remove the blocks is if you have some things ready to go, as soon as the motion starts to happen and they start to feel the muse, you can kind of turn effects on, turn them off, and just sort of give them the room in the sandbox to work.
Right.
And I find if you're pre-patched and ready to go, I do tend to vibe the room out a little bit, try to have it look nice and feel nice so it's not just bright lights,
Right.
But I do find that for me personally, the conversations before we start working, and that's something that I've experienced a lot over the years, really leads to the creative thing. And sometimes people want to share music, so I try to welcome that and do a little bit of that together before we start, just sort of sending out the probe. And I think when that happens, everyone focuses a little bit more and sort of shows up,
right. And is this where, I know you do engineering and producing. Is this, is it any different when you're only engineering versus also producing, or how does that work?
Yeah, I think just due to my background and the way that I came up in studios, I'm so used to doing the engineering and then sort of doing the producing at the same time. So when I am strictly engineering for someone, I am I do whatever they need and I execute whatever they need and just sort of get it to sound the way that they hear it in their heads. When I am working as a producer / engineer, I try to have a little bit more of a creative approach as far as the sounds or having an opinion on the sounds. But sometimes, as you know, when you're engineering, if someone says to you, this is exactly how this is supposed to be, you go, cool. Sometimes when you're working as the co-producer engineer person, you're also the sort of, I call it like vibe police, So I will be the first to admit that sometimes when I'm producing, my engineering gets a little sloppy because if people are inspired, I just go. I don't stop to fix things,
Yeah, and you don't want to lose the moment either. It's about keeping people inspired, and it's more important to capture it even in a non-perfect state than missing it completely.
It's true, and the guy that helped me learn how to record would always joke. And I remember he said, if you're doing your job correctly, the studio can be on fire and you can give the singer a 57 and he'll do one more take before you got to go. And it happened to me.
What?
That actually happened to me. I swear.
Jeez.
Yeah, we were working in a house and I remember I started to hear people like, what's that smell? And I was like, just finish the take and we'll go. push save, pulled the hard drive out and the fire department came. Everything was fine, but it really happened.
What? That's insane.
Yeah, man.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Is there, how do you keep up with new technologies and incorporate them into your work?
Sure. Do you mean more software stuff, or what are you exactly looking for?
I mean, I remember when we worked on the Animal Collective stuff, you brought in some crazy synths that I had never even heard of, and some really unique things. Like how do you stay on top of that? I know part of it came from working with Trent in that case, but
yep, the Swarmatron, the Swarmatron came from Trent. Yeah, I love that thing. It's interesting. I learn about most studio tech from the people that I work with.
Okay.
And because 9 times out of 10, what happens is somebody brings in something that I've never heard of or seen before. And if I like it or it really blows me away, I go, okay, hold on, what is that? And I have them show me as much as they know about it when it's kind of a relaxed moment. And I try to keep that sensory memory built up so I have these tools or, like little tricks up my sleeve or stuff like that. The thing that's really hard to keep up with is the software. For me, there's so many cool plugins and stuff it's not even meant to sound like anything. It just does its own generation of audio. That I think there's so many amazing third-party companies out there that it's limitless.
Yeah. I mean, I find there was someone recently that asked me like how many plugins I have, and I actually had to look, and I think I came up with a number like 800 or something insane. And, I use about 20 of them, it's like, so.
It's fascinating though, when you were talking about like us bringing some synths into East West or, modular rigs or whatever. There's a studio I work at all the time, and the guy that owns it has racks of synths and keyboards and all this stuff. And he says he's got every virtual instrument, known to the studio world or whatever. And then he always makes the joke that virtually nobody uses it. He's like, everyone always uses the real synth they haven't touched before.
Right.
No one, because everyone wants to be tactile and experience.
Right. That's true. Yeah, because you can, work on your laptop at home and do that and use a virtual instrument, So
yeah,
it's crazy.
And I think it's amazing for writing. I think the new tech, which is really, really cool, is really inspiring and really helps creative people make and write music that they would never dream of, because you go through a bunch of weird patches and you find one amazing thing. You push one key on your MIDI controller and you just go, what just happened?
Exactly.
And then all of a sudden you want to sing.
Right. For sure. So how do you help artists to find their unique sound if you're producing them?
That's a good question. My production starts with, again, a lot of conversations before we get into the studio. And I actually try to do a bunch of listening sessions together.
Okay.
I try to get with the artists or the solo visionary, and instead of suggesting things, because I feel like I always pull from the same colors on the palette, I try to see what they are bringing in to listen to. And a friend of mine has sort of like shepherded me through the hi-fi world, and this is how he did it. He would say, bring in some stuff that inspires you, and then I'm going to play some stuff that maybe you haven't heard yet. Okay. And see if, kind of take everyone's temperature, like, I don't like this, or, oh, I like this, let's keep listening to a few more songs.
Right.
And I think by listening to music together, it helps me get on the same page or close to the same level as that they're on. And so then when we get into the studio together, we have a bit of a vocabulary already built. And so when, people say, I want to have a unique sound, or when you put this song on, it's this song by me or something like that. I find that as a group, we're able to pull from the sensory memory part of it. Like, oh, I remember how we felt when we listened to whatever. Let's try to do something like that.
Right.
And we don't have that music there to listen to, so you have to be creative and do a version of it. Right. Another thing I do. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I really encourage people to do what they might think is a bit of a funny version of a song that they already have.
Really?
You've recorded. Yeah, I think when you record at home or you record a demo, the way I try to explain or think about it is, look, that's a great version. What if we do it twice as fast or twice as slow? Or what if you do it maximalist or minimalist? If you've already, essentially going against what they have already had. Okay. And we can just try it for fun. We're doing it right now on a session, and the original demo was made with drum loops from a real drummer, and the singer said, I don't really know if this is how I want to present it. So we're using an old rhythm ace, I think from the 70s.
Okay.
And, she's playing Mellotron on one hand and synth bass on the other hand.
Okay.
And some of the results are cool. Some of it, we are chuckling as we're doing it, but
but it's a learning experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes you go, actually, that 30-second snippet is so special. Let's just try to expand upon that.
Right.
And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't work, and you go track the demo version.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this, do you ever do mixing exclusively, or do you always kind of do start to finish with artists?
I mix for people a lot that I don't track. I always say mixing is my day job.
Okay.
I love mixing. And as you know, too, it's like a different part of your brain, And I think it's such a cool creative challenge when someone says to you, I'm going for this type of thing, and they hand you the audio files and you have to go, okay, how do I get there?
Right.
I love that.
Well, that's actually what I wanted to ask you, because, with me, like, obviously the references are super important. It's always critical to figure out where they want to take it and what their goal is. You were talking about how you sit down with artists and listen to a bunch of music. Like, how does that vary when you're mixing? What is your process for getting the references and figuring that out?
Sure. Yeah. I ask for, it's a bit of a brief based on what you like about the rough mix, what you don't like about the rough mix, and what you've always wanted to get out of it, or how you hear it. Okay. And then instead of I do ask for specific references if there's a vocal effect that you love, or a presentation of an album that you could help share that I could try to autopsy. But I really try to go for the brief, because and ask what the record's about, because a lot of people sort of say, these 4 core elements are what this record's about. So I really want to make sure they shine. Okay. And then I go, okay, cool. So let's work on that as the foundation and really try to make everything else bloom around it. And sometimes it's, a little bit more traditional. It's bass, drums, guitar, vocal. Sometimes it's guitar, vocal, and cello. Right. And another thing, it's funny that I ask about too, is how clean or dirty they hear their music. Right. Because I find that some people love distortion and some people do not love distortion. Yeah. and as you know too, distortion goes from super extreme to 1%, Right. So
very subtle.
I try to figure out what people are listening to or what they like, because I think people do love the sound of distortion, but they don't necessarily know it's distortion sometimes. Right. Especially some of these golden era recordings they're clipped.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
So can you talk about a particularly memorable collaboration with an artist and how you both inspired each other?
Sure. I would say one that stands out, something that I will carry with me for a very, very long time, is an artist, Emma Rundle, I talked about. Us making Engine of Hell together. That, for a few reasons, that album sticks out. We had worked together a long time ago on an album called Marked for Death. And when I had met Emma, she was operating, I guess you could say, a singer-songwriter, but her thing is left of center, and it was a little bit more in the metal world. Okay. And when we first worked together, there was drums, full production, big sounding music. And we'd always kept in touch. We'd always been friends when she'd come through town and tour. And then finally, one day she said, I want to make my Pink Moon. Okay. And I remember, I'm a big Nick Drake fan, and I love folk music, and I had a lot of listening sessions with her just because she's like an encyclopedia for that music. So she was showing me stuff like Pentangle and, you know, Bert Jansen, John Renborn, who came out of those bands, and all of that dark English folk from the late 60s.
Right.
And never in a million years would I have thought that that was where she wanted to go. And she sent me some demos, and I remember listening to them going, there's no guitar, it's all grand piano. And she goes, yeah, this is my principal instrument. This is where I started before I picked up guitar. And I was so excited because it was just to hear an artist use something that I didn't even know that they had a connection to.
Right.
Was so inspiring. And we did the album up at the Panoramic House in Northern California, which is a spot I record in a lot. It's just like, basically the house, half of the house is glass. It overlooks the ocean.
Nice.
And, you know, it's West Marin. You can't beat it. And I remember we were up there for a few weeks. I knew we made something special, but I didn't know how special it was until a few friends came up and heard just playback on the very first song. And they stopped it after the first song, and everyone looked at each other, and we were all crying because it was just it was just so powerful because Emma shed her skin in front of all of us, you know. And the person that I trained under, that was his specialty, was to take artists in a new direction.
Right.
And I really felt like we had done it. And it's something that I think about all the time because you also roll the dice when you make something inspiring and inspired. It's usually not where the artist is used to working or used to performing in. So it's very scary for them. It's scary for you. So you, at that point, you're also engineering, but also emotional support and a cheerleader all at the same time, you know, because during that project, there would be so many conversations of it was supposed to be a stripped down record, but then we would be trying harmonies and keyboards. And I remember I had to stay open-minded because sometimes those ideas were great, you know, but when you first hear something, you go, I don't know. And it was really important to just not touch anything and then listen the next day with fresh perspective. Because you know how it goes. You get married to something.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, so that, I'll never forget that.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah. Do you have any of those? You must have a few.
I don't know. I don't know. I wasn't expecting that. You can't ask me questions.
Sorry.
No.
I can share another one.
Okay.
I can share another one. There's a band called Dive that I worked with on an album called Deceiver. And I had met with the band. We did an audition session together. It was super fun. I didn't think that they were going to call me after doing the audition just because you do it and you see how it goes, you know?
Oh, jeez.
And yeah, it's okay. And I remember they called me, and as we were making Deceiver, we kind of hit the 10-day mark. I think we had we had almost 3 weeks in the studio, and then they did vocals at my studio. And I remember, same thing, like that band had been counted out at that point. There had been some, essentially just like drama with members, and, you know, I wasn't a part of any of that. And getting to see them in this new, connective, excited place, I got to really see them kind of come back. And they did a bunch of stuff that was totally different for them, which was awesome. You know, it was amazing. Like, they made a record that didn't sound like they normally do. And that was a very special thing to be a part of that. Nice. Just to really, really help them bring that home.
Nice. That's
awesome.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah.
I just want to take a quick break and tell you about my free guide detailing my techniques for recording huge snare sounds. Check it out now at brandondecora.com/huge-snare. And now, back to the show. So I know, we both worked in studios of all different types. What do you do when you have to work in a B studio or whatever, like a subpar place? Like, what considerations do you take?
If I'm going into a B studio, which is very often, I try to bring speakers that I know and that I trust. Mm-hmm. And I try to spend an hour or half an hour listening to music that I know in that room just to feel it out.
Right.
And the only thing, I'm sure you do the same when you engineer, I'm very heavy-handed. I want to print the sound the way that the person is inspired. I don't want to kind of futz with it later. I'll always dig into stuff later. But when I'm working in a room that I've never worked in before and I feel like maybe some things are a little funny and I don't know, I might not go as hard as far as EQs and compressors, just because I don't know if I'm hearing everything. I worked at a studio recently where I was very unsure of the control room, but I had my room tuned recently by someone. Okay. So I brought in the reference song and I actually tuned their room to feel like mine a little bit because I brought my monitors. And I kind of went, oh, okay, with this, now I know what I'm hearing, because for the last, 6 hours the other day, I heard this one song on repeat, and the acoustician taught me how to listen to the bass in a certain way. Huh. So I try to bring reference material. I try to bring a pair of speakers.
Wait, and so how do you listen to the bass in a certain way? What's the trick?
Well, I don't know if there's a trick. So I always pronounce his name incorrectly, George Augsburger, come by. Uh-huh. And he tuned my room with James Taylor, Line 'Em Up. Have you heard this song?
I don't think so.
Okay. It's James Taylor. Yeah. So there's that, and it's a Frank Filippetti mix, so it sounds great. Mm-hmm. And George was showing me how, on that song in particular, there's two things to listen for. There's a very subtle micro pitch shift on the voice. Mm-hmm. So if you can hear it, something is funny with the center image on the speakers. It's supposed to be invisible. Huh. So I remember hearing it, and I turned their monitors until the vocal became very pointed on the high end. And in the intro, there's so much bass on the chorus that I don't even know what instrument that is, if it's a fretless or what. Huh. But it goes down to something crazy like 20 or 30 cycles and speaks down there. It's not just like it's fallen off.
Right.
And I remember him looping the intro and basically first verse and first chorus a lot. And when he was tuning my sub and having me tune it, I remember he goes, that's what you have to listen for. And it was like I think it was the second, third note, those two. Mm-hmm. Or the fourth note. I can't remember. I have it written down. But he's like, if you can hear the fourth note and it doesn't totally disappear, the room's in good shape.
Wow.
And the studio was great. It had a pair of those new Ocean Way. I forget the model, but it's the one that it's like a horn speaker with the two subs underneath.
Right.
And just did some futzing around. I was so happy when I took the stuff home to mix.
Nice.
It was
That's
great.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Is there any current or recent projects you want to speak about?
I have some coming up right now that are not out that I cannot talk about.
Of course.
One that I'm really excited about, that there's a few. There's one that just came out like a week and a half ago, band called Narrowhead, an album called Moments of Clarity.
Okay.
We made it almost a year and a half ago by the time it came out, with the delay for vinyl and all that stuff.
Right.
But that was a really special album to make for a few reasons. I'd been a big fan of the band, and a friend had sort of put us together after they were coming to LA, and I had hit them up about recording. Mm-hmm. And during the pandemic, I actually had a few very long phone calls with a producer who helped me with pre-production.
Okay.
And I had always known pre-production was important. I had a version that I would do on my own, but I sort of adapted his pre-production process into what I started doing moving forward. And it made such a difference to the point where by the time we finished rehearsal and pre-production, we were so dialed that we cut everything live in 3 days and then did overdubs on top of it. But 2 guitars, drums, and bass live.
Nice.
And that was, we... Sure.
So what are some of the tips, if you don't mind?
Yeah, the tips on pre-production.
Yeah.
Of course. So the way that I kind of do things now and sort of adapted it is you get the demos, whether they're a guitar vocal in front of an iPhone or a fully flushed out demo. And then going into a rehearsal space and examining everything. I used to be in jazz band in high school.
Okay.
And I used to have an instructor who, she was amazing. She would break down 16 bars of a chorus and examine the relationship between the rhythm section. Or even you have to go further. You start with the drum groove. Is the drum groove what everybody wants? Is the drummer playing it correctly the way that they want to play it? And once you hit that point, you go, cool. Let's examine the relationship between the bass and the drums. Are things feeling the way we want to? Are the grooves lining up the way we want to?
Right.
And then once you get there, keep adding on top of the foundation. So now bringing in rhythm guitar, lead guitar, and vocals, and very carefully, and not in a too surgical way, but examining how do you get into the verse? How do you get out of the verse? Do we need to examine stops, fills, pauses?
Right.
Once you get through that portion, we kind of go back to the acoustic guitar or piano and the vocal and really make sure the top line is good. And the way I was told to listen for it, which really helped me, was rhythmic and melodic independence from the chords, which I had never really thought about. But if you think about it, not necessarily pop music, but any song that you love, if that melody is singable, you can play a real basic on the keyboard or the guitar.
Right.
So the past few years, I've been really paying attention to that when I'm producing with someone.
Of course.
Is making sure that the top line really sails above things, but is memorable. And then after you have that dialed in, taking that strong foundation you made with the ensemble and putting it together. And then there's always going to be a few sets of holes that you have to tighten up. Or we did another thing that was very beneficial for me being in jazz band was learning how to rehearse. I think a lot of people just go in, they play the songs a few times, and they call it good. But sometimes you got to slow the songs down, or maybe not have a guitar player play so the drums, the bass, and the vocals can all hear each other.
Right.
Because I remember working on that album and another project, which I'll talk about, where both projects went, that's what you're playing there? Okay, cool. I have to change what I'm doing because I like what you're doing better, And that situation is more about me just setting everyone up and saying, off you go. I'm going to help chaperone it, but it's got to feel like your ensemble. So there was that one and another project that came out earlier this year, a band called Julie. They're a 3-piece from here in LA. And that was a sort of like a pinch me moment for me to work with that band. I'd seen them open up for some friends. I loved it. And we just became friends. We started talking. And when we went into rehearsal and went into pre-production, it was so excited because I didn't hear any demos. So they just said, we don't feel comfortable sending anything because we don't like our practice space recordings. Why don't you come by and hear what we have? And I just remember I showed up. They had already vibed the room out. They had Christmas lights. The lights were low. And it was such a one-of-a-kind, unique guitar sound. And it was a 3-piece, right? So it was just the loudest, most body-shaking experience. When I actually felt like I was floating above the floor hearing the song. It's called, it's called Page 4, A Picture of Three Hedges. And I remember hearing that in the room and having to contain myself, just going like, wow, yeah, this is great. Being like, oh my God. Like I had just never heard, I had never experienced music in a room at that volume like that before.
Right. That's
and
awesome.
I think, we had a similar pre-production experience, but then we spent a lot of time rehearsing because you're in the practice space. And it's free.
Yeah.
There's no pressure on you when you go into the studio. So by the time you go into the studio, you know what you have, you know what you want, and it just becomes fun and experimental.
Right. Right. You have room to play, for sure.
Yeah, and there's no stress on a musician if someone plays a song 3 times and they go, you know what, I really don't like my drum sound. Can we change it? And you go, yeah, of course, because you're just going to play it 3 more times and nail it.
Right. Exactly.
Exactly. It becomes fun. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. So I like to finish up all the podcasts with the same few questions.
Sure.
First one is, what is your most influential teacher?
Influential teacher.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it doesn't have to be just one, but because I know that can be hard. But
yeah. For me, I would say it's a few people, and I can tell you why. The person that I did my apprenticeship for was a producer named Flood. He's a British producer.
Yeah.
And he was very important to me because he was the one that clocked my inspiration and excitement to do things a little bit differently. And he encouraged that. So even though I truly didn't know anything about gear or had never seen Pro Tools before, it wasn't this exclusive situation. There was never a moat around him. He really, really, really was like, come on in, we'll show you how to do it. And he was also very honest. He said, look, it's going to take you about 10 years of making records before you start to really do some work. So please don't expect this to be a thing. And I needed to hear that. That was and obviously he's partners with Alan Mulder, and Alan's always been special to me. He's at the end of an email or a phone call whenever I need help or advice. He gets back to me still, which is great. And then the other person that was a very, very important audio engineer to me was Larry Getz, who owned the Lair Studios, which is now closed. But I worked at the Lair for 12 years. And Larry would come in to every session I did at the end of the night or in the morning and give me feedback and tell me what I was doing wrong. And he wasn't, and he didn't hold back. He did not hold back, which was, but he did it in a way that wasn't demeaning. And that was really important for me.
Nice.
And it's something that I am grateful for because I had a studio to work in. You record a drum set hundreds of times in a room. You really learn how to record a drum set.
Yeah.
And, I got the sort of esoteric and very left of center inspirations from Flood, but to have Larry essentially whip me into engineering shape over the years, it really helped me, And, I would say the other thing that's been a really big influence on me actually isn't someone in the studio, but there's a book that I read recently and is sort of revisited a few times over the years, but it's called The Body Keeps the Score. Have you heard of this book? It's a book that basically explains how we have these different experiences, positive or negative, that weave into our fabric, and it's helped me really be sensitive in the studio all the time. So being able to clock if an artist is not feeling well or they're inspired, so it's time to work. It's been cool to have that on my radar. So worth checking out for sure.
Nice. So we briefly touched on this earlier, but the next question is, what is your favorite reference track? When you gotta check out a new studio or whatever. Obviously, it can vary a little, but what's your go-to?
Wow. I'm streaky. There's a few I listen to all the time.
Uh-huh.
I listen to, of course, the title is going to escape me. The first track off of Sea Change by Beck.
Okay.
I think that album in general sounds amazing, but in particular, that first song is very special.
Nice.
I'll listen to that. I will listen to, if I'm checking low end, there is, I believe it's called Find My Way by Nine Inch Nails. I think it's off Hesitation Marks.
Mm-hmm.
The low end on that is absolutely astonishing. I don't know how it was done.
Mm-hmm.
I use that all the time. Another one that sounds incredible, that's a full frequency reference track, is Sleep to Dream by Fiona Apple.
Okay.
In particular, that vocal sound and I don't know what the bass is, but there's this massive deep low end between, it sounds like kick drum and some sort of bass.
Right.
And her voice and that piano, pretty hard to beat.
That whole record to me sounds awesome, for sure.
It's amazing. Yeah. And someone pointed out recently how great, I've always thought her vocals sounded great, but after I had my room adjusted, listening to Sleep to Dream was kind of like hearing music for the first time. I know it's a little hyperbolic, but it blew me away. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
And,
all right,
and I think when I...
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
and
go
then
ahead,
I do
ahead.
I check guitar stuff here and there.
Uh-huh.
But the one I use the most, I think, for guitar music is a song called Farewell to the Fairground by White Lies.
Mm-hmm.
And that album sounds amazing, but that song in particular, the drums, bass, guitar, it's the way it's done.
Nice.
Sounds incredible to me.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Awesome.
What's yours?
Mine, I've answered this a few times now on the podcast, but I am a big fan of an Australian band named Carnival, and they have a song called New Day that has it starts really mellow and chill and then gets really heavy in the choruses, and it's very full range and has great low end, and I don't know. That's one of the things that I've always gone for. I'm just super familiar with it, So
another one to check out. Do you know this engineer John Wood? Do you know about him? He's an older guy. He was part of the Sound Techniques studio in the 60s.
Okay.
Overseas. And I think he did Pink Moon from Nick Drake. And he was, if you look up some of his recordings, if you like acoustic guitar and vocal music, I use those a lot for reference if I'm working in a bit more of that setting.
Okay.
Because I don't know how he did it. I've actually emailed with him to get some info. But it just sounds like the guitars and the vocal are not even in the speakers.
Right.
He's really worth checking out. Yeah. There's an album he tracked called The Hobbit by John Renbourn that just sounds incredible.
Nice. Awesome.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. So last question. What would be one tidbit for an upcoming engineer?
I think it's really important to learn the basics. It's something that I wasn't stressed in the beginning and I had to play catch up doing.
What do you mean by the basics?
Really understanding balance and polarity.
Right.
That is something that the past 10 years I really have dug into. And that has been helping my mixes, I feel, 20 times over than any other plugin.
Right.
I know that sounds like I'm some old salty dude, but I really think, and I was just doing this on a project that I tracked recently, I spent so much time balancing before reaching for EQ and any of that stuff, that I did my best to lock everything in with, phase or polarity and balance. And then from there go, okay, how do I lock the image into place? Is it blurry? Is it kind of lean?
Right.
Working on that stuff. But I find that if you really, really, really learn how to balance things, everything else is a bonus on top of that.
Right. Well, sweet, man. Thank you so much for being on the show, and it was great chatting with you.
Yeah, man.
Awesome.
This was great.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me, dude.
Definitely. Thanks so much for listening to the show. As you know, I'm just getting this started, and I'd love your feedback on how I'm doing, if I should keep this going, what your thoughts are. Feel free to visit proaudioprofiles.com and send me a message. Until next time.